What if I told you the moon just disappeared? One minute it's there, lighting up the night sky, and the next, it's gone. For most of us, this would be a shock, sure, but the real consequences are much deeper than you'd think. It wouldn't just be a darker sky, it would be a complete transformation of life on Earth as we know it. So let's break it down and get into the nitty-gritty of what a moonless world would look like. First off, let's talk about the light. The moon reflects sunlight, which is why it's so visible at night. Without it, the night sky would become a lot darker. Cities and towns have artificial light, but out in the countryside, away from all that light pollution, it would be pitch black. We're talking a level of darkness most of us have never experienced. For those of you who love camping or hiking, this would make nighttime navigation way harder. Even out at sea, sailors have relied on the moon for centuries to guide their way. So if the moon were gone, nighttime travel, whether by land or sea, would become much more difficult and dangerous. But it's not just humans who would struggle. Animals, especially nocturnal ones, would be thrown into chaos. Bats, for example, rely on moonlight to help them hunt. Sea turtles use the light from the moon to find their way back to the ocean after hatching. Without that natural light, many species could become disoriented or lose their way entirely. Imagine the ecological consequences. Some species could face extinction because they can no longer navigate their world properly. It's a small change, but the impact would be huge. Now, let's get into something even crazier, the tides. We all know the moon controls the tides, right? Its gravitational pull tugs at Earth's oceans, creating the regular rise and fall of the tides. If the moon disappeared, the tides would be reduced dramatically. Instead of the usual ebb and flow, coastal areas would see much smaller, weaker tides. At first glance, you might think, okay, no big deal. But hold up, the tides are essential for certain marine ecosystems. Fish, crabs, and other sea creatures rely on the movement of the water for their life cycles, breeding, feeding, and even staying alive. So without the strong pull of the moon, these ecosystems would fall apart. The ripple effect, pun intended, would be massive, not just for marine life, but for the people who depend on those ecosystems for food and livelihood. You see, the oceans are like Earth's circulatory system, and the tides are what keep that system moving. Without them, the balance is off. Ocean currents would change, and that could even affect weather patterns. More on that later, but let's just say the absence of tides would mess with far more than just the beach. Speaking of messing with things, the moon does more than just control tides. It also stabilizes Earth's axial tilt. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Earth is tilted on its axis at about 23.5 degrees, and that's what gives us our seasons. Spring, summer, fall, and winter all happen because of this tilt. The moon's gravitational pull helps keep that tilt stable. Without the moon, Earth's tilt could vary wildly over time. We're talking extreme swings. One year you might have a mild summer, and the next you're dealing with boiling heat or freezing cold. It would be unpredictable, and that would mess with everything from agriculture to daily life. In the worst-case scenario, Earth's tilt could shift so much that some areas might not even experience traditional seasons anymore. Imagine living in a place where it's summer all year long, or winter. Sounds fun for a minute, but trust me, it would get old fast. Crops would struggle to grow, animals wouldn't know when to migrate, and our whole way of life would be thrown into chaos. Oh, and did I mention that Earth's rotation would speed up? That's right. Without the moon's gravitational pull, Earth would start spinning faster. Right now, our days are 24 hours long, but without the moon, days would get shorter, maybe by as much as a few hours. That means less time for sunlight and more disruption to our natural rhythms. We'd have to adjust everything, from how we grow food to how we sleep. Now, let's dive a little deeper into the weather changes I mentioned earlier. Earth's climate is influenced by the ocean currents, which are in part driven by the tides. Without the moon, those tides would weaken, and ocean currents could change direction or even slow down. This would have a ripple effect, again, pun intended, on global weather patterns. Some areas might become much hotter, while others could cool down. More extreme weather events like hurricanes and storms could become more frequent because the balance of heat in the oceans would be off. So, without the moon, you'd not only be dealing with darker nights and shorter days, but also stronger storms and more unpredictable weather. Before we go any further, we'll continue with our video in just a moment. But before we do, if you're finding this as mind-blowing as we are, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more mind-bending scenarios. Now, back to the moon, or what's left of it. One thing that's easy to overlook is how the moon has influenced human culture. Throughout history, the moon has been a symbol of time, seasons, and even religious events. People use the phases of the moon to create calendars, plant crops, and mark important events. Without the moon, we'd lose that connection to time. Sure, we have digital clocks and fancy technology now, but that cultural connection would be lost. The moon has been a source of inspiration for poets, artists, and dreamers for centuries. Imagine a world where no one writes songs about moonlit nights or creates art inspired by its glow. It would be a little less magical, wouldn't it? Let's talk about space exploration for a minute. The moon was our first stepping stone into the universe. The Apollo missions, the dream of going to the moon, it all paved the way for our modern understanding of space travel. If the moon disappeared, would we still have that drive to explore? Or would we feel like we lost a piece of our future? The moon has always been there, looming large in our collective imagination. Without it, the stars might feel a little more distant. But beyond the cultural and emotional impact, there's another factor we haven't touched on yet: earthquakes. Yeah, you heard that right. The moon's gravitational pull affects not just the oceans, but also the Earth's crust. If the moon were gone, Earth's crust might become less stable, leading to an increase in seismic activity. You could see more frequent and more intense earthquakes, and possibly even more volcanic eruptions. So without the moon, you're not just dealing with darker nights and stronger storms, you're also looking at a much shakier world, literally. Now, let's take a moment to think about how humans would adapt. Could we survive without the moon? Technically, yes, but it wouldn't be easy. We'd have to rethink everything, from how we grow food to how we measure time. Entire industries would be affected, and governments would need to plan for new kinds of natural disasters. Over time, our technology and society would adapt, but it would be a tough road. We might never go back to the way things were. Life on Earth would have a permanent scar, a reminder of the moon that once was. So, we've talked about how humans would adapt, but let's get into what long-term life on Earth might look like without the moon. Remember how I mentioned the moon helps stabilize Earth's tilt? Well, without it, we'd have to think about the bigger picture. Over thousands, even millions of years, Earth's tilt could wobble so much that the planet might become unrecognizable. In the long term, Earth could end up with extreme climate swings, icy periods followed by scorching heat. Entire ecosystems would struggle to keep up, and humans would need to be constantly innovating just to survive. Imagine living in a world where you never know if the next year will be livable or not. One season you could be dealing with extreme drought, and the next, massive floods or brutal cold snaps. It would be like Earth itself became unpredictable, cat's eye, almost like a planet-sized roulette wheel. This kind of instability could push human innovation forward in some ways. Maybe we'd come up with new ways to survive in harsh environments. But let's be real, it wouldn't be fun, and a lot of people and species wouldn't make it through. Let's switch gears a little and talk about how the moon affects human biology. Did you know that our bodies, to some extent, are tuned to the cycles of the moon? For example, there's evidence that the full moon affects sleep patterns. Without the moon, our sleep cycles might shift in unexpected ways. If the length of days changes, as we discussed earlier, that could mess with our circadian rhythms even more. People might find themselves feeling groggier, out of sync with their internal clocks. Over time, this could lead to widespread issues with health and productivity. And then there's the psychological aspect. The moon has always been a source of comfort, wonder, and even romance. Imagine a world where there's no moon to look up at during a quiet evening, no full moon to light up a spooky night, and no lunar eclipses to awe us with their eerie beauty. The night sky would feel emptier, less magical. It's hard to quantify, but the loss of that connection to something so ancient and constant might take an emotional toll on people. Let's not forget space exploration. We've sent people to the moon, and one day, we might even set up permanent bases there. The moon has always been our gateway to the stars. Without it, space exploration could take a huge hit. The moon serves as a sort of practice ground for future missions to Mars and beyond. Without that nearby stepping stone, would we still have the same drive to explore? Or would the loss of the moon make the universe feel even more out of reach? Now, speaking of the universe, let's imagine the effect the moon's disappearance would have on our cosmic neighbors. You might think that losing the moon is just an Earth problem, but it could actually send shockwaves through the solar system. The gravitational balance between Earth and the moon has been in place for billions of years. If the moon vanished, that balance would be disrupted. Other planets, particularly Mars and Venus, could experience subtle shifts in their orbits. It's like when you take one cog out of a machine. It might not break everything right away, but eventually, the whole system could start to wobble. Over time, this could have unpredictable effects on the solar system as a whole. But what about the moon itself? Where would it go? If it just vanished without a trace, we'd never know. But let's entertain the idea that something might have caused it to leave its orbit. Maybe an asteroid knocked it out of place, or some cosmic event sent it flying off into space. In that case, the moon could become a rogue object, drifting through the solar system or even beyond. There's a small chance that the moon could collide with another planet or be captured by another celestial body's gravity. It's kind of wild to think about our moon floating somewhere out there, far away from us, but still existing in the universe. We've covered a lot of ground, but let's go back to Earth for a second. I mentioned earlier that losing the moon would affect our oceans, our tilt, and even our weather. But there's one more thing we haven't touched on: Earth's core. The moon's gravitational pull doesn't just affect the surface, it also has a subtle impact on Earth's molten core. Over billions of years, the moon has helped to keep the core in motion, which in turn generates Earth's magnetic field. This magnetic field is crucial because it protects us from harmful solar radiation. Without the moon, the core could slow down, weakening the magnetic field. Over time, this could make Earth more vulnerable to solar storms, which could knock out power grids, disrupt communications, and cause all kinds of technological chaos. So we're talking about darker nights, extreme weather, shaky ground, disrupted ecosystems, and even potential technological disasters. The moon may seem like a distant, unimportant part of our lives, but without it, the world would be an entirely different place. One filled with uncertainty, danger, and constant adaptation. Now let's wrap this up by thinking about the big picture. If the moon disappeared, could we survive? Technically, yes, but it would be a struggle. Humanity has always been resilient, finding ways to adapt to new challenges. But this would be a challenge on a whole new scale. Our world would never be the same again, and we'd have to rethink almost every aspect of life, from how we grow food, to how we sleep, to how we explore space. So next time you look up at the moon, appreciate it a little more. It's not just a glowing rock in the sky, it's an essential part of life on Earth. And if it ever disappeared, the ripple effects would be felt in every corner of our planet. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild journey. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more mind-blowing what-if scenarios like this one.